I'm Patsy Thompson, and I'm going to show you some tips so you can get the most out of your quilt suspension system. Some quilting tables have a lip underneath that interferes with the table clamp. Oftentimes, you can work around that by placing a piece of scrap wood that effectively widens the thickness of the tabletop so that it's all the same thickness. Remember, the table clamp can open to a maximum width of 1 5/8 inches, so as long as your hacked width of the top is that amount or less, you should be good to go. Now, what happens if your table has a lip underneath, but you're not able to use the workaround that I just showed you with the shim? That's the situation I have with my George table. Even though adding a shim below the tabletop won't work, I am able to place my table clamps in the back corners of the table because there's just a little more space there for them to take a nice bite. Let me show you something else that's kind of cool. If you look at the hole inside the table clamp, you'll notice that it's square, just like the shape of the suspension system backbones. This means that I have the ability to orient each backbone in 4 different orientations. When I quilt on my George, I can orient them away from the table or toward the table, and I make that decision based on the project I'm working on. And don't forget that you can use whatever table edge you want for your clamps. This means you can use the back, the front, the sides, and you can even mix and match, like use a back and a side. Here, I've mounted one of my clamps toward the extreme side of the table, and the other clamp is mounted on the back of my table. I'm going to be hyper quilting these 2 featherettes. No matter where I'm going to quilt on a given quilt, the first thing I do is pierce my needle in my starting position and bring up my bobbin thread. I leave my needle in the down position, and then I survey my quilt to determine the best placement for my hand clamps on the quilt. In this case, I want to leave myself enough slack to be able to quilt both of these featherettes before I need to change my clamp position again, so I'm deliberately leaving myself enough slack in my system so that I'll have that expansive movement available to me. Remember, the only time the quilt will pull against you is if part of that quilt that's adjacent to you has fallen below the level of the table surface. Having slack that's on top of the table or on the table will not hamper your ability to quilt. Remember, the entire purpose of any quilt suspension system is to eliminate the weight of the quilt. With that weight eliminated, there is nothing pulling against you as you work along the quilting of your quilt. This allows you to quilt even very intricate designs, like this small hyperquilting I'm doing inside of a featherette. There is literally nothing pulling against me, so I can freely move this quilt, even in very fine increments, as I work. And you can see that here I'm moving from one featherette to a completely different part of this quilt to hyperquilt a second featherette, and because I've added enough slack into my system, I don't have to stop to reposition the hand clamp on the quilt. Many folks get confused when they first start using a suspension system and they set it up with very little to no slack. Remember, the quilt does not need to be entirely in the air. It's fine to have quilt slack on top of the table or above the table. These will not pull against you in those positions. This will all seem a little bit foreign when you first start, but honestly, the more you use a suspension system, you really develop a second nature about where to put those hand clamps in order to quilt most efficiently. Now, once I finish quilting in that area and I'm ready to move to a new zone, I need to reconfigure my clamp placement to get the best use out of them in the new area I'm going to quilt. Now I want to stitch a background fill design in this area. The ruler work framework that's already been quilted is what establishes the boundaries of where I can lay down my background fill design, so I place my clamps so that I can complete all the quilting needed to fill this zone. You will develop a second sense about how much slack to leave in your quilt the more that you use a suspension system like this. Now I'd like to move to a border zone where I can do some hyper quilting. This particular border zone, because of its location on this particular quilt, is a great example of a situation where I really only need to use one clamp. I've positioned my quilt to minimize the volume of quilt that fits in my harp space. Notice that I really don't have much quilt bulk directly behind me or to the right of my needle. This means that I really don't need that second clamp on the back side of the table, so I'm going to start my border using only my left-sided clamp. Again, I'm leaving myself a fair amount of slack so that I can get a fair amount of quilting done without having to stop and alter the hand clamp position. For long borders, you may well find that you can benefit from using the second clamp on the quilt once you've traveled far enough of a distance into the border. This is something you're going to learn as you use the system. So there you have it. Tips to make your quilt suspension system work better for you, and hacks so you can make some workaround maneuvers. If you haven't tried a quilt suspension system yet, you really just have no idea how much easier it will make your quilting. Of course, you can find these suspension systems on our website at patsythompsondesigns.com, along with a lot of other machine quilting aids. Now, so long and take care.